Thank you guys for coming to listen to Professor Khaled Beydoun talk about his new book, American Islamophobia, The Roots and Rise of Fear. With us, we have Professor Abou El Fadl to moderate. He's a teacher here and one of the world's leading experts on Islamic law and also refugee law, humanitarian law. Professor Khaled Beydoun is a critical race theorist. He is formerly on the faculty here as well, and right now teaches at University of Detroit Mercy Law School. So we're going to open it up for Khaled Beydoun to talk for like 5 to 10 minutes about his new book, and then Professor Abou El Fadl will comment about it, and we'll ask some questions. So thank you.
I'm going to walk around because I need to see the PowerPoint while speaking, but thanks so much for the introduction. It's great to be here. I graduated from this law school in 2004, and I worked here for a couple of years as the Critical Race Studies Fellow. So it's always great to come back to UCLA and specifically the law school. It's really exciting to come back and talk about an issue I've spent a lot of time thinking about, writing about, and now talking about for the last couple of years, which is Islamophobia. And many of us know this term has emerged in recent years because of the emergence of Trump, obviously as a presidential candidate, and then eventually as president. The term Islamophobia has captured widespread resonance. It's captured the imagination of not only scholars but activists, advocates, hate mongers, bigots, and so on. And the term is obviously stuck as the concept, the operative term that explains this rising animus that's unleashed and inflicted not only on Muslims, but also communities that are perceived to be Muslims. So I'm going to talk about the book and why I decided to write the book, but just for some context, I came to law school here, and 2 weeks into my first year of law school, the September 11 terror attacks happened. I was far from home. I grew up in Detroit, far from family, far from my community. I came here specifically because I wanted to study critical race studies, thinking I'd be an international human rights attorney. However, after that moment, I realized that my intellectual trajectory, my professional trajectory, all of that was really shifting because I really wanted to address this new demonization, this new criminalization of Arabs, Muslims, and those perceived to be Arab and Muslim here on the ground. And as I was studying critical race theory with Professor Cheryl Harris, with Professors Kimberly Crenshaw and Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, I realized that the legal literature examining Arabs and Muslims was sparse within critical race theory scholarship, that oftentimes much of the scholarship focusing in on this demographic was not written by people who looked like me, came from the same part of the world as me, and didn't see that part of the world in the same way that I did. And not only that part of the world when I'm talking about the quote unquote Middle East, but also the experience of Muslim Americans here stateside in their historical and legal narrative. So I didn't think I had the ability, to be frank, I'll be honest, I'll keep it real with all you guys. I didn't think I had the ability to become a law school professor. I wasn't one of those, gung-ho, raise my hand all the time type of law students in law school. I was a good law student. I enjoyed writing, but more so I really enjoyed the intellectual traditions of scholars like Edward Said, who wrote, "I am an Oriental writing back at the Orientalists who for so long have thrived upon our silence." And that quote really captures the motivation and the inspiration why I decided to write this book. I had spent the last 4 to 6 years before writing this book dedicating a lot of time, dedicating a lot of energy, writing law review articles examining the historical demonization of Muslims during the naturalization era. For those of you who have studied immigration law, you might know that from 1790 to 1952, that whiteness was a prerequisite for citizenship. I wrote an article when I was a fellow here, going on to the job market to become a law professor, examining how this law had effectively created a hurdle for immigrants from the Muslim world trying to become naturalized citizens here. And I realized really early on that whiteness was really tied to what we understand today as Islamophobia. And in addition to whiteness was this master discourse, Orientalism, which divided the world into this binary right? We had the Occident, which was the West, and then we had the Orient, obviously, which was synonymous for the Muslim world. Individuals who came from the Orient were racialized and cast as non-white and classified as Muslims who presumptively could not become citizens. Spent a lot of time writing articles like that, wrote articles examining how the construction of blackness led to the erasure of seeing black Muslims as bona fide Muslims, enslaved Africans in the antebellum South. How this Oriental construction of Muslim identity was constructed in direct opposition to blackness. Wrote articles examining how counter-radicalization, the signature counter-terror program installed and established by the Obama administration, was having an acute and disproportionate impact on poor working-class Muslim Americans across the country. Wrote articles on affirmative action, a piece called Reverse Passing with Professor Erica Woods at UNC. Point is, I was writing all these law review articles, right? And I realized early on that, hey, this is great. You know, it's helping me move up in my career, you know, establish a reputation in the field and so on. But I wasn't touching the people. I wasn't reaching base communities, audiences, activists on the ground, people like my family members who couldn't read a law review article, right, to understand what was unfolding on the ground in America, especially during this point when Islamophobia was increasing. So, didn't really have the time. My mom was yelling at me about, you know, getting married and having kids, getting old, that kind of thing, right? So some publishers reached out to me and they're like, you know, Khaled Beydoun, you got these interesting ideas about Islamophobia. I'm big on Twitter. I'm tweeting all the time. Why don't you think about writing a trade book? I was like, what's a trade book? You know, a book that's meant for a broad audience and so on. So what I did is I said yes, and maybe it wasn't a wise decision, but I spent roughly 6 months looking to deconstruct and, you know, kind of translate all this academic literature that I'd written, all the media work I had done, writing op-eds, opinion pieces, speaking to people in the media, writing a book that could reach lay people, right? People that didn't have law degrees, people that couldn't understand law review articles, people that couldn't understand really complex and, I guess, intricately framed op-eds. So I wrote this book that addressed a range of issues that I thought were really salient in developing a broad understanding of what Islamophobia is, what it meant, and what the stakes were. One thing I realized early on, I wrote a law review article about it, was proposing a new definition of Islamophobia that was anchored in law. Prevailing definitions of Islamophobia at the time, and definitions that still sort of dominate today, tended to fixate on what private individuals were doing, right? Hate mongers, bigots, individuals that were attacking conspicuous Muslims. We remember this, for instance, when the 3 students at UNC were murdered in 2015. That's how Islamophobia was being framed, narrowly as private animus towards Muslims or perceived Muslims. But because I've studied this for a long time, right, I knew that the law was doing something, that policy was doing something, that specific programming and policing programming coming from the state was also partaking and collaborating in this project we understand as Islamophobia. Therefore, I define Islamophobia as also being structural, right, or state-sponsored in the way that we understand state-sponsored or structural racism, right? An additional definition or dimension of Islamophobia that I introduce in this book is dialectical Islamophobia. There's a communication going on between the state and the polity whereby, by virtue of structural Islamophobia, the enforcement of law, policy, presidential rhetoric of secretaries of state like Pompeo, who was just appointed, right, saying things like the United States is interlocked in a war with Islam, with Muslims and so on. That presidential rhetoric is illustrative of structural Islamophobia and is communicating specific ideas and messages to the polity at large. Right? So the book does this academic work, does this theoretical work, but couples it with a range of stories, anecdotes, vignettes, many of them that we know, right? Many of them that you may not know. Issues that address anti-black racism in the Muslim community. How does anti-black racism and Islamophobia intersect? Right? the way Islamophobia is discussed broadly in society is premised upon this conflation where we see Muslim identity as being synonymous with Arab and South Asian identity. Even though a third of the Muslim population in the United States is black, even though the Muslim population in this country has always been primarily black majority. There's that dissonance and it's rooted in law, based on the construction of blackness and how white supremacy works. So as a critical race theorist, it was my objective to grapple with Islamophobia in a way that coupled it, right, that framed it within the context of American white supremacy in the broader racial project, right, that talked about how xenophobia and nativism also intersects with Islamophobia. I open up the book with this vignette where I'm actually here in LA going to do a talk at Cal State LA, roughly, I think it was like 2 weeks after the travel ban. The first travel ban was enacted. I get into a car. The Uber driver was this young Salvadorian driver who was contemplating conversion to Islam, right? And I start with that because I really wanted to grapple with the idea of how people tend to think about Muslim identity. And in addition to that, how we tend to think about what Muslims at this moment, what issues they're grappling with. Somebody like Juan was grappling with the idea that in his community, in Pico Union, you had these pop-up checkpoints, right? You had expedited removals, and because he wore a beard and was on the cusp of converting to Islam, also had to deal with counter-radicalization policing, which was piloted here in Los Angeles and being enforced in communities adjacent and inside the downtown Los Angeles community. So that is the objective of the book, again, grappling with, addressing, overlapping and intersecting all of these distinct issues that deal with race, white supremacy, immigration, counter-radicalization, the war on terror, to demonstrate that Islamophobia is far more comprehensive and broad than we might think, and that the victims of Islamophobia, inflicted by private individuals, the state's proxies, the state's subcontractors, and the synergy between the state and the polity, the victims are far more heterogeneous, far more diverse, and far more distinctly situated than we might think. I think one thing that really drove me to want to become an academic, to be frank with you, and I'll close with this point, is I was really getting frustrated with the academic literature as a student and as a fellow, even from progressives, right? There was always this move, even from liberal scholars, that were framing Muslims, even Muslim victimhood, in flat terms. The Muslim victim was always, there was kind of like this prototypical or archetypal framing of the Muslim victim. It wasn't humanized in any way, right? It wasn't intersected with how Muslims range in terms of experience and circumstance with regard to class, with regard to gender, right? With regard to legal status and so on. So this book, if anything, is an attempt to try to interject a more nuanced, complex understanding of who Muslim victims are at a moment where everyone's ears are kind of perked up to what Islamophobia is, because Islamophobia has obviously become a mainstream social justice issue in a way that it hasn't been in previous years, and complicate how we understand Muslims, Muslim victims, and the broader experience of Islamophobia at this critical moment. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have and look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. I'll make a couple of quick comments, and we're anxious to get to the discussion. Khaled Beydoun we at UCLA we're very proud of him. He's a spectacular example of many things, but among the things that I'm particularly proud of the success of the CRS program, and that it is possible for our graduates to get into the academic market and to become law professors. And I think the fellowship program at CRS played a huge role I've met Khaled before he got into the Islamophobia field in my Islamic law class, so I've had the privilege of of watching him develop intellectually for a long time. And it really is a credit to the CRS program and the CRS faculty. And for UCLA graduates, I often get students asking, is it possible for us to get into the academic market? And the answer is yes. Khaled demonstrates it. The second point, I really do encourage you to read this book. Was one of the people among many who wrote an endorsement for it. It's highly readable. Unlike a lot of the literature written on Islamophobia from an anthropological perspective or sociological perspective, it's a book that is at once fiercely intellectual, but not caught in its own technical jargon, which I really appreciated in the book. It's like accompanying the author in a journey, in an intellectual journey from the first page to the last page, and he takes you through a variety of layers of realization about the phenomenon of Islamophobia and its cultural and structural implications, and as well as very serious consequences and trajectories into the future. In addition, I should say that Khaled Beydoun is the first person in the first law faculty of the United States to develop a course on Islamophobia and the law. I've cheated from him, what goes around comes around, so I cheated from him, and I've consulted his model in putting together my own Islamophobia and the law course that should be offered next year. But he's the first to do it, there's no doubt. Which I think is going to become an increasingly a serious field of engagement, because Islamophobia is not just about targeting Muslims, and it's not just about a single political issue. Islamophobia has become weaved into the politics of globalization, into the way we've dealt with popular demands, the Arab Spring in the Middle East, the way we contributed to aborting the Arab Spring. It has become part and parcel of the way we deal with Saudi Arabia and the native aspirations of Saudi citizens, the way we expect dictators to engineer Islam in a certain way that we find acceptable. So ultimately, Islamophobia has become part and parcel of international politics and the war on terror. And it's costing, every single passing day, it's costing the world not just billions of dollars, but also millions of lives. Islamophobia is part and parcel of the fact that we've killed about 2 million people in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's no mention of that. No one seems to care. That's part and parcel of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is part and parcel of the horrendous concentration camp that is maintained in Gaza, with the active cooperation of not just Israel, but principal instigation of Israel, but cooperation of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and the fact that it gets very little billing in the international scene. We are, in our age, time and age, seem blinded to the fact of a consistent and persistent humanitarian disaster. So Islamophobia has seeped into so much of our world, and it has become the trop for sexism, for racism, religious bigotry. It's a way that the old uncivic virtues are reasserting themselves under the cover of Islamophobia, because if you articulate prejudices and bigotry as if they are a principled position against a religious ideology, then you can sort of sneak in all types of racist and sexist attitudes. And that's precisely what I really appreciate about this book, is that it documents so much, but does it in a very readable and engaging fashion. I get asked to read and endorse books all the time, and it gets a bit tedious, but with this book, I finished it in 2 days, in 2 sittings, which is, you know, considering how much I read, it's quite an achievement. So, that's it. Now let's take your questions.
Yeah.
Were you were raised in like Dearborn or something? Or
In Detroit, right outside of Dearborn.
Oh, in the let's say, the Verner area, southwest, or where?
No, not southwest, but right between, if you know Detroit, it's between Greenfield and Southfield, a community called Warrendale, which is adjacent to Dearborn.
Oh, yeah, right on, you're right down the street from Dearborn.
Yeah, yeah.
So don't you think, you know, at your stage you could run for a judgeship or change policies or running for office, you know? You know?
I've done, no, I got too many skeletons in my closet to run for office.
That seems the neck of the policy change, it goes through the, you know.
Yeah, but I think one way to effectuate change, and I think scholars like Professor El Fadl and scholars like Kim Crenshaw have shown that as scholars and public intellectuals, you can, you know, bring about change in other ways, and that's, you know, I'm trying to follow the models that they've laid forth.
Yeah, but don't you think that Dearborn has changed? I mean, everybody gets along there?
No, I don't think that Dearborn has changed. I think Dearborn specifically, demographics have changed considerably, where there's sectarian issues, there's ethnocentrism even within the Arab and Muslim community and so on. There's the prevalence of anti-black racism. You know, Dearborn and Detroit are right next door to each other.
Yeah.
So to say that it's changed, I think, is a simplistic assessment of what's really going on.
Michigan, the attitude of, you know, you guys have been there for like 40 years now, or more. Muslim communities, because every time you go on the national news, something happens in the Muslim community, there's somebody there on the news that is the spokesperson who they interview.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that signal's changed though.
So I think I wanted to ask, talk about a little bit about Southeast Michigan, because I'm from the Toledo, Ohio area, which is the border. I think despite very, very long histories of Muslims in that area, there's still really violent, virulent Islamophobia and a lot of, especially internal community issues, as evidenced by one of the oldest mosques in Perrysburg, Ohio was bombed in my senior year of high school, or lit on fire. My senior year of high school, the mosque I grew up in. So I think I wanted to briefly reference that. And then I wanted to ask, how do you think about your work in academia as related to the work of public intellectual? And then how do those things relate to work as activists and work with community organizers? And kind of what is the relationship you see between those two kind of fields?
Well, I came to academia as an activist first. I'm a longtime activist involved in a range of issues since being young, whether it be issues tied to the region. You know, for instance, before the war in Iraq, I worked on fighting against the sanctions in Iraq. Issues tied to self-determination in places like Egypt, the Arab Spring. I worked on affirmative action for a long time on the ground in Michigan. So I came to academia as an activist, and I think one thing many academics tell you is that the two don't mesh, right? That if you are an activist, you can't be an objective or neutral academic, and vice versa. I'm trying to do otherwise to show that, the law is obviously, and this is what you learn in critical race theory on day one, is that, the law is politicized, and obviously it's racialized and so on, so this idea that the law is neutral or objective is a fiction. And I knew that coming in, and I knew that was one of the drivers why I wanted to study critical race theory here. So based on that baseline, I know that not only can quality academic work be driven by the spirit of advocacy, I think that you could actually extend and enforce academic work theory in ways that can be activist in nature. Right? And we see that obviously in very vivid ways with the BLM movement, the way that Professor Crenshaw's work and intersectionality has been unleashed on the ground. The term is being talked about by teenagers that are young at protests, rallies, and so on. So there is this binary, we talked about this on Saturday, that theoretical work and activism and practical work are distinct and mutually exclusive as a fiction. Right? So, and I think for me what was attractive about becoming an academic was the model laid forth by public intellectuals, right? People like Edward Said, people like, Frantz Fanon, and our critical race theory faculty here, that I wasn't really interested in writing articles that were not going to penetrate beyond legal academia. I wanted to use my research in my work to be springboards and ammunition that could lead to me talking about these issues on the ground and to effectuate change. And that's the kind of model that I try to follow.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-blackness, and especially if you see any way that non-black Muslims can help shed more light on the black Muslim community and to be better allies to black communities in general?
Yeah. So, anti-black racism and Islamophobia intersect in a range of ways, right? In the book I talk about how anti-black racism is actually perpetuated within mainstream Muslim institutions, places like ISNA, MSAs, and so on, which become oftentimes unwelcome places for black Muslims to be members and specifically to be leaders and so on. And I talk about a couple of personal stories in the book. I'll share one, right? So a couple of years ago in 2015, I was asked to speak at the ISNA conference, the Islamic Society of North America conference, which is kind of the foundational Muslim organizing conference in the country. It happens every year in Chicago. I came to talk about a piece that I wrote on counter-radicalization, right, CVE. And one of a recognizable Muslim leader, a guy that is well-known, influential, well-liked in the broader community, was organizing an informal meeting of quote-unquote Muslim leaders. I don't know what Muslim leader means. I don't think I'm a Muslim leader, but he invited me. And I realized that he invited the vast majority of the 53 people he invited, not a single one of them were black, right? Even though there are a number of influential, prominent, trenchant black Muslim leaders in the community, often many of them that I work in organizations like Muslim ARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, and so on. None of them were black, and I probed them on this, like, why didn't you invite Ashanur? Why aren't you inviting Camila Rashad? Why aren't you inviting Margaret Hill? So on and so forth. And that was illustrative to me about how these mainstream Muslim organizing and advocacy spaces were either intentionally or by virtue of institutional memory, just marginalizing and excluding black Muslim leadership. So what we did was effectively stage somewhat of a coup, right? And we just brought 10 people with us to the meeting, just kind of like interfaced with the leaders and just sat down, and they looked uncomfortable, but I think those are the kind of protest actions that are needed to bring about change. And I mean, in addition to that, you also, and this is interesting, I might get in trouble for saying this, I might get in trouble for writing this in the book, but you only live once, so I'm not scared of getting in trouble. But one of the most prominent sheikhs in our community is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And for those of you who might know, there's another prominent Muslim conference that's held every year in Toronto called RIS. It's the Revitalizing Islamic Spirit Conference. And he was asked a question by this prominent media personality, Mahdi Hassan, what do you think of the Black Lives Matter movement? Right? And Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who I respect, who's a brilliant imam and so on, effectively, kind of parroted problematic racist responses about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a criminal movement. These are individuals who are, I think he said thugs or something along those lines. Really problematic things coming from a really prominent, widely respected individual, right? We can talk about the role of him being a white convert and what kind of impact that has on that perspective. But that coming from the very top of the Sunni Muslim establishment in this country demonstrates just how entrenched anti-black racism is. It wasn't, kind of a casual statement from a young student or an activist, right? Or, your auntie or uncle just, off the plane from Egypt or Pakistan, right? This was somebody who was bred in this country. This was somebody who has the ears of millions of people, not only in the United States, but across the world. And for him to say something that damaging, I think, demonstrates just how seeped in and how deeply rooted anti-black racism is within mainstream, right? Mainstream Muslim American institutions. Yeah.
Could you, we haven't had a chance to read your book yet.
Yeah.
I'm going to, but right now, could you share some tips about how progressives can be better about talking about Islamophobia and its impact? I mean, just from what you've said so far, I've gleaned that to talk about institutional and systemic Islamophobia, which is not talked about when we focus on the private. And the second question is if you could talk just briefly about, just gender and Islamophobia, how the impact, I know that could be a huge discussion, just is different for women or queer people, or, that might have a different impact.
Yeah. So the first question, I think it's important. So I'll respond to it in two ways. First, obviously, is to frame Islamophobia as something that's also enforced and extended by state policy, right? By law, police programming, and so forth. It's actually something that is extended by the state and every level of the state. Federal government, state governments who are passing these anti-Sharia legislation and bills, but also municipal and city governments, which are working closely with FBI to enforce counter-radicalization policing. So structural Islamophobia is happening at every level of government. The second point is to not caricature Islamophobia as something, as a system that is exclusively inflicted or unleashed by the right. Right? There's this prevailing caricature that Islamophobes are only conservatives, Republicans, bigots, individuals on the right end of the spectrum. By right, I mean not the correct, but you know what I'm saying, right? The right of the spectrum. But it's also something that is extended by liberals, right? By progressives and so on. So the Obama administration had expanded surveillance beyond the measure and the degree of the Bush administration, establishes counter-radicalization policing as a signature counter-terror program, partakes in this good versus bad Muslim binary to carry forward counter-radicalization policing. Hillary Clinton did the same when talking about Muslims while campaigning, always qualifying Muslims as terror-hating, peace-loving, moderate Muslims, these qualifiers, but also from popular media personalities like Bill Maher. Right? Bill Maher, in my opinion, is one of the most damaging Islamophobes in the country, but he is championed and celebrated by the left, and so on. And his audience is primarily a liberal and progressive one. But he's bringing on people like Asra Nomani, Sam Harris, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, right? This cottage industry list of speakers who himself kind of parrot his ideas about Islam being entirely and inherently corrupted and violent and so on. So it comes from the left as well. With regard to gender, and there's various ways you can go with that question, but obviously speaking, we can look at hate crimes and hate incident statistics to show that the primary victims of private Islamophobia, and also structural Islamophobia, when we think about counter-radicalization, are women who are deemed conservative, right? So women who wear the hijab, or more conservative iterations of the hijab, are oftentimes the primary victims of private Islamophobes, who inflict violence upon individuals who are conspicuous Muslims. But oftentimes the state kind of preys upon conservative Muslim women as either prospective radicals or individuals who are actually harboring and aiding and abetting male radicals. So it's coming from both angles in that regard. Professor Thaxton?
So, welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I haven't read the book yet. Khaled and I go back about 10 years now, so I apologize, but I'll jump on it. So if this is in the book, excuse me, but what I'll try to do is pick up on a couple of comments, and also I think from my Alvina's as well. So, Professor Jody Armour, who's at the law school across the town that we won't speak about, but he wrote a book about 20 years ago titled Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, the Hidden Cost of Being Black. And some of the arguments that he articulates there, some of our talk, I believe are present in your book as well. The one I want to focus on, he talks about, it's not a new concept that he develops, but he does try to flesh out more and give some kind of empirical weight to this concept of the black tax, right? Because the hidden cost of being black. And his major focus is on, again, the depiction of blacks as inherently criminal, and the criminal justice system's response to that. So now racism becomes reasonable in that context. But one of the interesting things about the black tax is he says, you know, the resource, even outside the criminal justice context, and this is something that's been articulated by author Ellis Coast, who wrote Rage of a Privileged Class, and focusing on middle-class African Americans and their experience with racism. And this is, it's not, right, it's not just class, actually race matters. And there is these thoughts that are interesting to me now, because the article that just came out in the New York Times focusing on racism and the class immobility with respect to blacks who are in quote-unquote the lower class, who are able to ascend to higher socioeconomic brackets. But also interesting is the fragility of the black upper class and middle class, and particularly with respect to black males, how those males are more likely to live in conditions, socioeconomically speaking, that are less affluent than their parents. And you don't see this not only among whites, but you don't necessarily even see that even when you take into account gender, that difference among black women relative to white women, but you see it particularly with respect to black men. Okay, so what does all of this preamble that I'm giving you mean? I'm just curious, if we want to map, then we would say it's not a black tax, but a Muslim tax in terms of tangible effects, the resources, not only financially, physically, but also cognitively, that are drained by fighting against Islamophobia. What would you either imagine some of these kind of concrete effects to being, or what type of research program would you think would be necessary to try to flesh out how the Muslim tax would be?
Yeah. Yeah, so I haven't read Professor Armour's work, but from the way you framed the black tax, I think there are some major distinctions, right? Because Muslim identity is obviously a racially, heterogeneous identity, and how Islamophobia is unleashed. And when I say Islamophobia, I mean it broadly, whether it be private Islamophobia or what the state is doing, is oftentimes experienced based on the racial, gendered, socioeconomic identity of the individual. So the tax, I think, the Muslim tax, is going to be contingent upon who the victim is and what the victim looks like, right? So for instance, I'll give you some examples. So if you are a black male Sunni Muslim living in Philadelphia, right, which we know Philadelphia has a large and established African-American Muslim population, counter-radicalization from the state is going to look dramatically different than it is when it's enforced in a place like Dearborn, which is largely, Arab Muslim, recent immigrant, right? In Philadelphia, you have the intersection of racialized and violent criminal policing, which is it's still framing the black Muslim male with the same tropes that apply to the black non-Muslim male, right? But in addition to that, based on how the state might perceive black Muslim identity, which is shifted, right? Now you have the idea that radicalization is specifically a Sunni phenomenon, and even more than that, a Salafi phenomenon, and many black Muslims in Philadelphia largely gravitate and practice Salafi iterations of Islam. So those individuals are still going to be perceived and subjects of interest with regard to counter-radicalization policing based on the religious tradition or interpretation they follow. But in addition to that, while walking the streets of Philadelphia, the black tax intersects with the Muslim tax because they're still going to be profiled by police members as a consequence of being black males, right? So they're experiencing a compounded tax by virtue of being black males and Muslim males at the same time. Now, when you look at the Arab experience in a place like Dearborn, for instance, you have a distinct kind of trope, right? In Dearborn and places like Hamtramck in Michigan, a large number of Arabs living in Detroit also, there's distinct circumstances. Part of it is socioeconomic. Part of it is a large number of these individuals are, vacillating between indigent and working class status. Many of them are undocumented. Many of them are recent immigrants. So the tropes that are assigned to those communities align with those specific circumstances, right? The idea of foreignness, being a recent immigrant, the idea of being a recent immigrant is tied to the presumption that individuals are more conservative religiously speaking, or tied to transnational terror network or an organization like Hamas or Hezbollah and so on. So the counter-radicalization and surveillance coming from the state is going to be different than it is for the black Muslim male in Philadelphia, who is viewed to be a citizen from a formal perspective, and classification of that individual more so as a homegrown radical, which is the new parlance of the state, versus the individual as a recent immigrant in Dearborn, being a foreign terror threat. So the tax is going to be contingent upon the circumstance and the subjective identity of the individual.
Within the Muslim community, there's a lot of discussion back and forth about interpretations of Islam, the theology, like whether it's a peaceful religion, a beautiful religion, whatever. But does any of that actually matter, like as far as the law and the structural and the politics? You know, does theology have any role to play in what goes on for Islamophobia?
Yeah. So I'll defer to the professor here on questions with regard to interpretation and ijtihad and all of that. But I think where it does, it does have a role. And Professor, maybe you can help me with this. Is from the vantage point of the state, right? The state. So structural Islamophobia has become far more literate of Islam. The state has since 9/11, right? That's why you have students who are wanting to work for the State Department, taking classes like Arabic. When I was taking Arabic class, it was I guess a hipster of some kind, or, two kids who wanted to get a PhD in Arabic one day. It was an entirely different demographic. Now it's people who want to go on and work for the state. So the state has become really knowledgeable about the distinctions, the interpretive and sectarian distinctions within the Muslim experience in the community, and they're capitalizing on that. Right? I wrote this article that is coming out soon called "Bisecting American Islam." It had a clever subtitle, which I forget now. But basically, it wasn't that clever, otherwise I'd remember it. But the state is now, it engages in this good versus bad Muslim binary, and obviously, Bush, formally, adopts that in his war on terror vision. President Obama strategically employs it. Trump kind of collapses it, is what I see. And I think he sees Muslim identity at large now to be, categorically vile and evil and so on. But the state was really wise in partnering up and collaborating with specific Muslim traditions and interpretations that it could effectively enlist as allies against the war against the more concerning elements or factions within Sunni Islam. Wahhabism, Salafi iterations. So the state, for instance, in Montgomery County, the FBI in Montgomery County, when it launched its CVE program, worked really closely with the Sufi community, an organization called WORD, right? And Sufi Muslims are persecuted and killed en masse in the region by Wahhabis who view their tradition to be sacrilege and so on. It did the same with Shia Muslims in Dearborn, right? Who have a kindred enemy in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, who view Shia Islam as being apostates and sacrilege and so on. So the state has become really knowledgeable in kind of looking at these fissures within the broader Muslim American community and trying to identify different factions that have which they have a kindred kind of enemy or nemesis against to carry forward the broader war on terror project, but specifically the counter-radicalization CVE programming happening stateside. And you'll find that a lot of the organizations receiving grants and that are prominent spokespeople within the state are coming from these specific sectarian communities and traditions that the state has sort of endorsed or sanctioned as being the good Muslims.
And that's problematic too.
Yeah, exactly. It's really frightening, and it leads to divisions, paranoia within the community. And it happened in the Metro Detroit community in a very frightening way, where and I talk about it in the book, here were a group called the Lebanese American Heritage Club, which is a Shia Lebanese organization, received $500,000 a year in renewable grant money to effectively launch CVE, counter-radicalization programming, which would focus specifically on the Sunni elements of the community, which are largely Yemeni, Palestinian, Syrian, and so on. So there's the specific objective to not only enlist these elements, but also intensify and exacerbate these divisions within the community.
And they also draw on a lot of Islamophobes for their expertise
Yeah.
in Islam.
Yeah, and that's a good question actually, because I think one thing I didn't raise that I want to talk about is that Muslims could be Islamophobes, right? Muslims themselves, can actually engage in enforce and extend this process of Islamophobia, and we see very vividly within the structural Islamophobic context. We had a debate on Saturday where we had this conversation.
I want to interject a question, if I can use the privilege of a moderator. There are two things. One, I'm fascinated by the intersectionality between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
How do you see them overlap, and in what ways are they different? And the history of anti-Semitism and the history of Islamophobia, which is rather rooted in history. The other element is that and I'm very curious to hear what you think about this. When during the Bush era, there are sort of the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary, privileged, quote unquote, liberal, progressive Muslims. Then we went on where progressive Muslims became part of the bad Muslim bunch, and the good Muslim archetype became sort of the self-hating Muslim. The Irshad Manjis, the Asr Nomani, the Hershi Alis, the Muslims who lynched themselves for being Muslim. Now, where do you see us going from there, especially during the Trump era? The definition of a good Muslim, Daniel points in, what's his face?
Emerson,
Spencer,
Robert Spencer.
Robert Spencer just came out as a book with quote unquote interviews with good Muslim archetypes, and it's quite fascinating document, because all the good Muslim archetypes are people who thoroughly hate their tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And they are endorsed as, well, these are your...
Yeah.
Where do you think, if the anti-Semitism issue and the second question of where are we going from here?
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels with anti-Semitism and not Islamophobia, but Orientalism. And you could see it really specifically during the naturalization era, where whiteness is also a religious project. So religious identity is also salient and critical to the formation and development of whiteness. So Muslim identity, which was not only racialized during this naturalization era, but viewed as kind of a rival civilization or a political ideology, was viewed to be irreconcilable with whiteness, right? So Muslims or presumptive Muslims could not become white because Islam was antithetical to how we understood whiteness, and how we understand whiteness is tied to Christianity, and specifically Protestantism at that time. The same was true for Judaism, right? Jewish immigrants who were coming stateside and were attempting or not attempting to become naturalized citizens, by virtue of their Jewish identity, which was also racialized as well, and viewed to be antithetical in opposition to whiteness. And I believe she's retired now, but Karen Brocken, who was a professor here, wrote a wonderful book, When Jews Weren't White Folks, I believe is the title, that talks about the specific experience. So this history of legally enforced anti-Semitism is very similar, if not fully identical, to the practice of legal Orientalism, which framed both Judaism and Islam as being irreconcilable and non-meshable with whiteness. So the roots of Islamophobia today, stem from legal Orientalism. Orientalism is the mother of modern Islamophobia. I talk about that in the book. The second question, dealing with self-loathing Muslims and how they've been employed by the state. There's an entire cottage industry. There's a wonderful study by Nathan Lean, which became a book called Fear Inc., the Islamophobia industry, something along those lines, which talks about how think tanks, lobby groups, politicians, government agencies perpetually refer to this short list of individuals who are either self-proclaimed Muslims or disavowed Muslims like Ayad Hirsi Ali, who effectively market this really, trite but damaging narrative about how Islam is inherently vile, inherently violent, inherently misogynistic. And it's more than rhetoric, right? Because what these individuals have had to say have justified war, right? Have justified war in Iraq, and this idea that it is one of the primary objectives of not only the state, but even Western feminists, is to go into the quote-unquote Muslim world and to save these women who are having the hijab, the burqa, female genital mutilation, and so on being imposed on them, right? So the rhetoric of people like Asra Nomani, Irshad Manji, Zuhdi Jasser, is really being weaponized by the state to not only inflict and unleash policy, but launch conventional war, but also domestic war, unconventional war like we see with the war on terror. The Obama moment was really difficult and really interesting because there was a capitalization and an enlisting of individuals who were moderate or liberal politically, that had an ideology or a perspective that was being kind of castigated or set aside by the Bush and now the Trump moments, but became really strategically employable for Obama to carry forward his own war on terror project. So you find a lot of, moderate or I guess more liberal-leaning, I would call them native informants, justifying things like Guantanamo, justifying things like counter-radicalization stateside, justifying things like the extension of the national security entry and exit registration system up until 2011, which was really challenging because these individuals were individuals who were really critical of the Bush administration, were saying the right things superficially and outwardly, but behind closed doors were being employed by the Obama administration to carry forward really damaging programs and policy.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about where you see the Trump administration taking Islamophobia? I know they changed countering violent extremism to countering Islamic extremism now. And also, what you think about the Trump administration's almost partnering with the Saudi state.
Yeah.
And not just the Trump administration, but the American left as well, with like Mohammed bin Salman coming on 60 Minutes to talk about how they're liberalizing Islam.
Yeah. Well, he just appointed Mike Pompeo, right, who is a brazen Islamophobe, to Secretary of State. Pompeo has said something along the lines of any Muslim leader is a presumptive terror threat. He also tried to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization, which was strategy to cripple and silence a whole host of Muslim civic organizations from engaging in a range of cultural, social, fundraising, lobbying, and political activity, especially the prominent ones like the Council of American Islamic Relations, ISNA, IPNA, and so on. So this is the guy who's Secretary of State now, right? He's echoing the same sort of ideas and views that helped Trump get elected. So it's not surprising. So I think people tend to focus on the travel ban, the Muslim ban, and so on as being the signature Islamophobic policy or program extended by the Trump administration. I think it's far more menacing than that. You can look to the personnel that he's appointing. And yeah, he's proposed to convert countering violent extremism to countering Islamic violence, which is kind of this intensified, steroided up version of CVE, driven by this clash of civilizations binary, right? With Obama, again, remember, it was driven by this binary that there's good Muslims that we're going to enlist as informants to help us find and identify the bad Muslims. Trump collapses that wall. They're all bad, right? All Muslims are bad. So counter-radicalization is going to work under that baseline, or based on that baseline. The second question is that, if you ask me, Saudi Arabia is an Islamophobic government. You know what I mean? So it's not surprising to see Trump, who's a brazen Islamophobe, working really closely with another Islamophobic government, which is systematically persecuting Muslims in the region by way, whether domestically, whether it be Muslim minorities within the bounds of Saudi Arabia, or engaged in expansion of what I find to be I ain't a religious scholar, but this is take my professor hat off and put my activist hat on, a specific interpretation of Islam that is that facilitates classifying and branding specific segments of the Muslim community like Sufis, Shia, a whole swath of Sunni Muslims as being bad Muslims, driving the kind of persecution, driving the kind of crises we see in places like Somalia, in places like Pakistan, where they're effectively using petrodollars to promote this brand of Islam that is really damaging and leading to the death, the en masse death of Muslims. So I would classify Saudi Arabia as an Islamophobic state.
I would like to understand what could happen to a young man who's lucky enough to immigrate to a Western democracy and has all the legal rights to make his own choices.
Yeah.
I'm from North Europe, so like France is longer, I'm in Germany too, and I'm just trying to figure out what's happening. But like, let's say somebody just wants to adapt, and just like education, professional career, date Western girls, what could happen from the family or from the religion if somebody lives what has been, is here a normal thing?
Yeah, so I would first say that a Muslim immigrant who comes here is not going to have access to a full-fledged range of rights, especially if they immigrate to the country today, right? If they come from a place like, I don't know, Egypt or Pakistan or Nigeria, and they're individuals who are practicing their faith, they're going to be scrutinized by, as soon as they get to that checkpoint in the airport, their visa is going to be, if they have a legitimate visa, let's say a student visa, their student visa is going to be scrutinized. If they're from a country that's listed on the travel ban, they might not be able to even come into the country.
No, this is not the point. The point is when somebody is welcomed. Like Germany has 1.5 million Syrians.
Okay.
Since 2.5 years, and they have legal rights.
Yeah.
And they will be there. And they will continue being there. And I just
Oh, I see
want to
what
see
you're saying.
what happens if they would adapt to what is for hundreds and hundreds of years of like respect and education and this.
Yeah. So I talk about this in an article I wrote called Acting Muslim, which is, it's now out, it's in the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review. I talk about it in the book too, actually, where I list out these distinct typologies of Muslim identity performance, and that would be a classic example of conforming Muslim identity, right? Individual, it's interesting because the process of assimilating or conforming to your host state is in turn effectively compelling the individual to hide, conceal, retrench, or disavow his religious identity. There's a tension there because assimilation means something more than just dating Western girls or going to McDonald's or watching the football game, right? It means dressing a specific way, speaking a certain way, not grooming a certain way, not going to specific institutions, not worshiping in specific ways. So there's this tension, if you will, where the process of assimilation, especially for Muslims, takes you away from your religious and cultural traditions.
Yeah, but what could happen? Are you getting killed? Are you getting punished? What will happen? Like, let's say you live just...
You might be surveilled, you might be wrongfully prosecuted.
By your own community.
What are fellow Muslims going to... I think the point is that if you assimilate, our fellow Muslims going to kill you for assimilating?
No. I think if you choose to conform, I think it's a myth to say that fellow Muslims are going to like classify you as, I don't know, like a sellout or an Uncle Tom or Uncle Muhammad. I mean, they're not going to do that. You know what I mean? I have friends who are conformist Muslims all the time who choose to go to the club. They might drink, and they date not only Western girls but Eastern girls. They do arrange it. So, but I'm not judging them, and there's no kind of like. Board of Muslim advisors to say, we gotta let that guy go. You know what I mean? That doesn't happen. Like any other community, individuals choose to express their identity in a range of ways. And they have the right to do so. That's the beauty of the First Amendment, theoretically speaking. You can exercise your faith the way you see fit.
So I'm actually a prospective student here at UCLAW, and I think the work done in the critical race studies program is excellent, and it's profound, and it's important. So I'm from Washington, D.C., so when the trauma ban hit, I was a paralegal at the time, and I actually went to Dulles and I was there. So my question is, all the theory that's in this program, which is, it's just immense, right? And it's critical race studies. What do you see as like the practical, tangible impact of that? So how does that how does everything that you say in this room translate to the rest of the world, or even just to America? Like
Yeah.
how, particularly at this time, living in DC under Trump, it's a very different atmosphere than DC under Obama.
Yep.
And I think Islamophobia in DC it's much more tacit than it is other places. So I'd really like to know how you see yourself translating this work to impact people and change how we conceptualize, you know, the people around us.
Well, because I'll say this, I'm not just saying this because I'm here, but coming to the UCLA School of Law was the best academic decision that I made. I was considering other law schools, but the fact that I came here and studied critical race theory with the professors that I studied with and the professors became mentors of mine was the best decision that I made for the very point that you raised, that I think that there's an unfair characterization of theory as being disconnected and divorced from what's happening on the ground. I'll give you some examples of the work that I've done. So not only translating the work, but I've already translated that work. So when I was a second-year law student, I took civil rights class with Professor Crenshaw, who's seated over here, and we spent a lot of time talking about affirmative action, right? The cases that were coming out of the University of Michigan, even the older cases, right? The Bakke case in 1978, before Fisher, obviously, because I'm old. I'm Fisher wasn't yet decided and didn't go to the courts yet. But 4 years later, after studying these cases, I was working really closely with Kim Crenshaw on the ground in Michigan. At that time, after the decisions were made by the Supreme Court, Ward Connerly and his aides were looking to abolish affirmative action by referendum. Right? They were going from state to state. In Michigan, there was a proposal called Prop 2, the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, which was looking to abolish affirmative action by referendum. So after engaging in the theory, studying the case law, reading all the important law review articles, I found myself on the ground in the very communities that I grew up in. All throughout Detroit, throughout the state of Michigan, working to educate largely poor working class of color communities about what this proposal was going to do. Because the way the proposal was framed was directed at duping these people. It sounded really good, you know, engaging the same kind of ideas of, you know, color blindness and fairness and equality, where, you know, somebody like my mom, whose mastery of English isn't that great, if she were to read that, she'd be like, I'm gonna vote for that, that sounds good. Right, so I found myself on the ground translating that theory into proactive and direct action. So that's what a program like a critical race theory program does. That's just one example of tens that I can give you, to be honest with you. And I'm happy to talk to you more closely, and I'd highly recommend you come to school here. Now, I'm not just saying that because I'm here, but for me, it was a transformative intellectual experience. But it also, you know, as a person of color, to see faculty of color that the school has is just was so existentially empowering for me, right? And I was looking at, you know, the Michigan Law School and other law schools across the country, but I would put especially if you want to do civil rights, critical race studies, this school is far above any of those other schools. And I'm happy to talk more to you about it if you'd like.
Kind of in that same area though, so now there's kind of a handful of scholars talking about, I'm going to try to make this make sense. There's a handful of people talking about the racialization of Muslims. So I'm just wondering, since you are coming from this legal framework, you know, what does this mean for equity in public policy and most interest, educational policy? And I know you have some work out there talking about the proposed census categories or changes in racial and ethnic categorizations. So when people frame it as the racialization of Muslims, maybe you could talk about your thoughts on the wording and framing in that way. But also, what does this mean for equity and inclusion? Like, if you could have your pick of the census categories, how do you include Muslims and the various races and ethnicities that they inhabit?
Yeah, so I think that there's a great book by Eric Love called Islamophobia and Racism in America, where his definition of Islamophobia is tied to the racialization of Muslim identity. I think that's one segment of it, and I think the racialization of Muslims, for my definition, is tied more specifically to private Islamophobia, because this racial caricature of who the Muslim is still embedded within the minds of private individuals, but I think the state is not racializing Muslims in the same way that private individuals and private actors are. So stepping to to that side where the state is engaged in a more comprehensive and broad understanding of Islam, which is sectarian, which is religious, which is demographic, and which is racial. It knows that Arab Muslims are distinct from South Asian Muslims and Black Muslims and so on. So when you talk about the census, and I've written a bit about the Arab American experience, right? For those of us who know a little bit about Arab American legal or racial designation, is that they're currently classified as white by law, right? And that derives from this naturalization era, specifically this 1944 case, ex parte Mohriz, which was the first time that a court had identified Arab Muslims as white by law. But I would not advocate for a standalone Muslim racial category because I think that neglects and conflicts with the real realities and the real racial realities and heterogeneity of the Muslim American experience, right? How would a African American Muslim, would they have to choose between the Muslim box and the black box? How about a Latinx Muslim? How about a white Muslim? Would they have to choose between the Muslim box and the white box? So I'll respond in two parts. Number one, I wouldn't want that classification because I don't want to perpetuate the myth that Muslim identity is racial, because it isn't. And second, and I've written about this extensively and advocated about it in my communities, that Arab Americans should divest from whiteness because that legal designation does not reflect their lived reality. For those who choose not to adopt that reality. Now, whiteness is fluid. For individuals who want to identify as white, they have that right, especially during this era of self-identification. But for individuals who, especially Arab Muslims who are conspicuous Muslims, it's really difficult to carry out the idea that you're white when both state-based treatment and societal treatment diverges from that designation.
You use the word anti-Semitism, but we've been using Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And the question I have is, do you think that using the word phobia, the way we would say claustrophobia, is a way to justify and maybe legitimate this? Being scared when it's absolutely not being scared.
Yeah. So for me, and there's like legitimate critiques against the term, and many of them I agree with, right? But for me, the term is just a tool, right? And I adopted the term because it's been embraced. It's been embraced on the ground, it's been embraced by scholars, and I don't think it's going anywhere. So regardless of the conceptual limitations of the term, and people had these debates about, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, and so on. Even racism, right, was thought to be a term that wasn't fully capturing what was happening to people of color on the ground. So I'm less concerned with the conceptual bounds of the term itself, and more concerned with how the term can be deployed as a tool to address and then counteract whether it be the fears, the hatred, the animus, and it's not only irrational. So it's a good point that you make, that Islamophobia is not only a rational fear, it's also rational, right? It's strategic, in which the state is looking to other Muslims to carry forward specific political, economic, or foreign policy objectives. So the term is limited, I agree with you, but I think for me it enables the work. It's a effective expedient that enables the work that I think I want to do and other people in this area want to do as well. Yep.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about the weaponizing by the state of various groups of Muslims who have certain kinds of interests. How have you seen that affect queer Muslim communities? And then more broadly, how are those communities being situated within the broader Muslim community? And then just, can you talk a little bit about counter-radicalization measures under Obama, how they were expanded, what they looked like, and what their impact was?
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring up the experience of queer Muslims. I actually write about it in the book. I think it's chapter 6 or something, right? So I was teaching in Orlando, roughly a mile away from the Pulse nightclub. And we all know the Pulse nightclub shooting that happened in 2016. I always drove by it, actually, because I'd go to this cafe and work on Orange Avenue, which was just a couple of blocks away from that nightclub. And after that happened, a number of friends of mine who were two gay Muslim men who hadn't come out the closet yet would talk to me about their experiences based on maybe a Facebook post that I put up and so on. And I came to learn a lot about the testimonies they shared with me about the struggles they were going through, and kind of this paradox that they try to navigate, that as a consequence of their sexual identity, that could not be reconciled with their Muslim identity and so on. So I try to give voice to their experiences in the book as best I can. And not many books or assessments of the Muslim American experience have addressed that. So I was really proud that I was able to at least maybe open up that conversation for others to address more robustly. But it's difficult. On one hand, an Orientalist trope, right? A common Orientalist trope is that Islam is inherently homophobic, right? And I'm not a religious scholar, so I'm not going to analyze that. But that same homophobia seeps into the other religious traditions as well. So I think it's unfair to single out Islam and Muslims as being, inherently and passionately homophobic. I think homophobia, and I'd be a liar if I didn't say that homophobia exists within Muslim spaces, right? Muslim communities of all sorts, and so on. But one thing that I have seen is that this new generation and new crop of Muslim American leadership is not only addressing that issue, but is looking to create spaces and engage in conversations to enable queer Muslims to voice their story. Because I can't voice that story, right? But what I can do as a scholar and kind of a thinker is to perhaps do the best job that I can to initiate those conversations where people who have those experiences can share their stories. But yeah, I mean, I see homophobia all the time in Muslim communities and spaces, and I see how it damages people that I care about and consider friends. Your second question was about counter-radicalization?
Yeah, just kind of, I don't know, for people who aren't super familiar with it,
Yeah.
what it is and how it impacts communities.
So I find it to be the most damaging, Professor, maybe I'd be interested in your opinion too, the most damaging war on terror program since the Patriot Act, perhaps even more damaging than the Patriot Act. It's basically set up where the FBI works really closely with local law enforcement, so the LAPD or the NYPD, build these close relationships and rapport through soft CVE programming, community task forces, mentorship programs. You have speakers from the FBI coming to speak to community centers and so on. Build these bridges and then launch hardline counter-radicalization programming where the FBI works really closely with LAPD or NYPD to seed informants. So for those of us who know what COINTELPRO is, it's a lot like COINTELPRO. It was practiced in the 60s where Muslims who look like me, practice in the same masjid as me, same mosque as me, are being seeded in those communities to collect data, right, gather data, and feed on to the police officer who feeds that information onto the FBI agent who might choose to go ahead and launch a prosecution, or even before prosecution, show up at your house in the morning to do one of these knock and talk interviews. And because they're deployed primarily in poor, heavily immigrant, working class communities, many of these individuals who are interviewed by these police officers don't know their rights, right? They don't know that this police officer has to have a warrant with them. They come in, they say something they weren't supposed to say, next thing you know, they find themselves in court and dealing with a lot of trouble. So that's how CVE, it's a short summary for how CVE works.
We have time for maybe one more question. Grace, if you'd like to go.
Can you speak just a little, I mean, this is such a huge topic, and of course the first step is identifying the problem and understanding what the issues are. But can you speak about solutions? Where does one start if they want to have the biggest influence, in making a difference? I mean, what can we do with this insight? And I'm sorry, I know it's a really big question, but
yeah. I think, so I'll be honest with you, I think Muslim Americans at large are really do a poor job building coalitions. So I think building coalitions with other marginalized and targeted groups, and meaningful, not only grass tops coalitions, right, between organizations, but also on the ground is really important. To tell our story in a way that is understandable and resonant with other targeted and subordinated groups. So I think that's the most crucial step.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
I'm plugging your book because
Okay.
it deserves to be plugged.
Yeah, it's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon, and if you reach out to Janelle at lawnet.ucla.edu, 20 copies should have come in for this talk. So if you're interested, you can reach out and we can hook up later. Thank you guys.
Thanks so much.